Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the IDRiM podcast, where today we have two distinguished guests that we will explore new publications from them. And then today we're diving deep to the concept that they introduced and reshaping how we think about the global challenges, which is polycrisis. As you probably noticed, how crisis seems to come not one of at a time, but banded together now, as we experienced with the several years back, the pandemics, the wars, the financial instability, the climate change, and many more. And these overlapping disruptions reveals how interconnected, fragile, and complex our world has become. So what does it mean to live in polycrisis era? And how do we study, anticipate, and govern risks that don't respect borders, sectors, or timelines? To discuss about this, today's our podcast have the opportunity to talk with the two respected guests, which is the Professor Ortwin Renn and the Dr. Huan Liu. Together, they co-authored the new paper, Bridging the Polycrisis and the Systemic Risk, which is, all of you can find it in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Science. So today, in these discussions, we'll explore how these ideas overlap, where they differ, and what it means for science, policy, and the publics. We'll talk about the frameworks, governance, and real-world examples, as well as how to communicate that and the future of risk in the turbulent world. So, welcome, Professor Renn and Dr. Liu. So, the first questions, of course, could each of you introduce yourself and tell us what inspired for these collaborations, making the seminal paper?
Okay, maybe I start, and then well, you can also add to this. I had a guest visiting tenure at Kyoto University, where I met Huan for the first time. And we both attended a conference in Beijing on polycrisis and systemic risks. And after the conference, we felt that it was very necessary to have a review paper on that specific topic, because there were so many different ideas about polycrisis, and there were also a lot of confusion about what it means and what it doesn't mean. So we both felt that it would be good to come together, and we did that. And we composed this paper, and it's now being published, open access, by the way, so everybody can get it. It's not proprietary anymore. And to get some orientation for people who say, okay, yes, as you said before, Harris, all these crises are interconnected, but how are they interconnected? What does that mean? And to make that a little bit better understood. So that was the main motivation for me, at least. And I also would like to see, Huan, what would you like to add to this?
Yes, thank you. Yes, as already introduced the background by Ortwin, and I think the main purpose is we want to establish a joint understanding of polycrisis and the systemic risk. That's the most we think is urgent needs and one of the most important purpose of this paper. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's jump into it now. So for the listeners, who are new to these ideas, how would you define polycrisis and systemic risk?
Yeah, I think there are two major distinctions. So one is that when we talk about risk, something is going to happen. If we talk about crisis, the thing has happened. I mean, we are not in a crisis if nothing has happened, but we can talk about risks, for example, risk of a financial collapse, even if that collapse is not there, but we fear or we have good reasons to believe that it is very close to happening. And so that's the first major aspect. The other aspect is that systemic risk, we often refer to risks that may endanger or threaten the existence of a specific service that's very crucial to society. So that the whole financial system collapses, or that a whole health system of a country collapses or something else. It also may have, when we talk about systemic risks, impacts on other risks, but those kind of related impacts is really the second major element of polycrisis, because what we're saying is that the impacts of one crisis respond to and react to impacts of other crises. So maybe the crisis as sources are not causally related, but the impacts are. So if you think about, for example, the Ukrainian war, that had an impact on the energy then had an energy crisis, that had an impact on food supply to Northern Africa, that had an impact on political systems there. So there's a cascading effect from one crisis to the next. And that's what we really call polycrisis. It means that one crisis affects the next one. And basically by two mechanisms, one is contagion, that really infecting one crisis the next. And of course, a pandemic would be the best example for it. And the other one is cascading, that the impacts of one lead to the next and the impacts of that to the next. And you have like, domino stones that fall into each other.
Is there any additional comments on that, Dr. Liu?
Yeah, that sounds great to me.
Okay, so from your explanations, Ortwin, it's basically looking how the timelines, which is how it differs on before it happens or it's already happening, and then how it's actually cascading into one into another. So it's basically, in order to do that, can we predict the polycrisis in advance based on looking at one crisis in particulars, or we should just wait it and see and how react as long as it goes, which is from your perspective, from the systemic and polycrisis, how should if we look at to the future crisis, how should we do? What strategy is the best at there?
Yeah, well, would you like to start? Who understand?
Please go ahead, please, Professor Ortwin, please.
Okay, sure. Well, the issue, Harry, is that, of course, we have a hard time predicting polycrisis. And the reason is that, a very minor impact can then be the cause for the next crisis. And we could not foresee all the impacts that are happening and how they are interacting with others. So that's a real problem. We can do two things. One is very close monitoring. So we can see, so we get at least some early warning signals that this kind of interconnections do happen. And the second thing is to do what we call stress tests, in which you say, okay, let's assume that these impacts may have impacts on others. Where are the weak points? Where are the vulnerabilities of the system? And that, I think, is a little different from traditional risk analysis. So risk analysis, we really looked at a risk cost, and then we try to find out what's happened then and how probable this is, and that we had a probability distribution, and now we can see, what might happen. With polycrisis and even a systemic risk, that's not a very good idea. I think what we need to do is to say, how vulnerable or how resilient, the opposite, is a system, whatever crisis come. And now we can say, how can we make it more robust so that if stressors appear, that it will still be able to cope with it, even if we don't exactly know what kind of stressors will actually come up.
Okay, so you've done a fantastic job of introducing, polycrisis and systemic risk, but where do they first come from? Because I've only recently just heard them. So in academia and policy discussion, where do they first emerge?
Well, I think, there always have been things like polycrisis, but they have become much more popular, or let's say much more frequent now. And the basic reason for this is that all the systems in which we operate are becoming more interconnected. That's partially through internet. And you can see that the internet basically makes connections to very, very different things. And if one fails, through internet connections, it may also fail to others. The other thing is fast communication. When crisis happened in one country, 50 or 100 years ago, it took weeks before everybody knew about it. Now it takes seconds. And so it may have immediate impacts. And a third thing is that we can see that issues become more complex, which means that, again, all the impacts of different events and different actions have impact on other things because they're all interwoven and interconnected. And that makes it very difficult at this point to see, where's the boundary of something. Formerly we have clearly said we have natural hazards. And, if there was an earthquake, we could see we have kinetic energy, and that, of course, has some impacts. Now we can see, well, that's not the full story. I mean, this kinetic energy can maybe hit a nuclear power station, as it did in Japan, and now we have suddenly a nuclear emergency, or it can hit a chemical factory and now we have emissions, or it can hit a river and then we may get pollution. So we have these cascading effects, and it's because everything is so interconnected that specifically with urbanization and concentration of industry in various areas, everything is physically very close, but also functionally interconnected. And that's why we believe that polycrisis has become a much more frequent phenomenon in modern days than it has been in old days.
Well, that's interesting to hear that it is more prominent today because of the systems already grows that actually interconnected. It's beyond the boundary of one country or one areas, one territories. So that's made me wonder, as you mentioned, that the Ukrainian war or the pandemic. Is there any perhaps older examples that perhaps, okay, this is the starting point that people talk about polycrisis or systemic risk from that?
Yeah, I mean, there are very, examples. I mean, you said Ukraine was one, and the pandemic, of course, is a very telling example. I think also what we can see, I mean, was, if you take as a financial crisis, 2008, that financial crisis led to a political crisis, specifically in among the European community. We've seen that Greece was almost bankrupt. That led to a whole issues of high debts of different governments that led again to the reduction of social policies for, giving more equity or social justice to people, that led again to protests. So we can see how one after another appears as a consequence of action before that. And that, I think, is an important aspect of polycrisis. I think one of the things that we can see is that very often it amplifies. One example was the mad cow disease. I mean, I don't know if you remember that, it's a long time ago. The mad cow disease, interesting enough, in Europe, killed less than 150 people over 20 years. I mean, it wasn't, compared to other hazards, it was very, very, of little influence and significance. However, it raised a lot of concerns about governance. I mean, a whole ministers had to go. We had a major economic loss in the UK economic sector, specifically on farming, and it had a major impact on trust in government. Although the original event wasn't that dramatic, the cascading events had a very strong impact on a lot of things. So we can see that there's also an issue of amplification. Very often the original risk may not be as high, and then people say, okay, well, we can deal with that. But then the corresponding risks that come afterwards, the cascading risk, that can get very high dimensions. And I think that's always or very often underestimated. And I know, Juan, if you know anything about maybe Japan or China, where you have an example like this.
Yes, and thank you for sharing the cases. And in terms of Japan and China, and as you also mentioned, the nuclear water and 2008 the crisis, and in terms of the 10 power crisis, it was actually first introduced by the complexity theorist by Morin and Kern in their 1999 book. And this is the first introduction of the Polycrisis, the term. And in their book, Homeland Earth, and they argue that the world does not face a single problem, but many complex interconnected problems. And I think this is the origin of the term Polycrisis.
Yeah, and to go back to the mad cow disease, the impacts are still there today. So, for example, anyone who lived during the period of the affected of mad cow disease, can't give blood to most international countries. So for me, I can't actually give blood outside of the UK because I was born during the middle of that crisis. So even today, I'm still impacted because I can't go to, say, Australia or America and actually give blood because I'm infected. So that means so it's only a small thing, but it's still an impact.
Yeah.
And I feel that, and actually I'm glad you kind of went back on the history of it, because the one I think of that was a big polycrisis, historically, and I wanted to get into the history a little bit more because I felt that some of the students, particularly the younger audience who are, because there's so many, I feel like there's so many like polycrisis events now, that it's like they think it's like a new thing. I mean, if you listen to people like David Alexander, it's almost like permacrisis rather than a polycrisis at times. And the one I thought of was Yom Kippur in 1973, where just which really had its origin in the 60s, where Egypt and Syria invaded Israel to take back its territory, which led to the Arab countries basically blockading oil exports to Europe and North America. And then obviously that led to huge financial crisis in Europe and North America, because where the price of oil went up 300% literally in a couple of weeks. And that I felt that was very much a combinational of the polycrisis of, Gaza and in Ukraine as well.
Yeah. And also, I think what you said before about, BSC, I mean, we still face the impacts of that crisis, and even, more today than, we may have thought about in 1973. And I think what's important there is that a lot of economic factors depend on political issues, and of course also psychological being and psychological mood, as things very dependent on how people perceive the future. And we'll see right now that a lot of people have very negative feelings about future impacts and future aspirations. And all of that, of course, is connected to this polycrisis concept. So in that sense, I think you're very right, Mark. We had polycrisis before, also 19th century and so on. But, we can say single events that pointed out, and we can even put a name tag and a year there. Today, I think we're confronted with it almost every day. And that makes it, I think, a little different. And I think the whole policy issue now needs to attend to this. One of the major elements that we have pointed out, and Huan was also very instrumental in this, to saying, okay, most of our countries deal with one risk at a time. Or with one crisis at a time. And we have agencies, let's say, for natural hazards. We have agencies for technological disasters. We have agencies for security. And now, since everything is connected, these agencies actually would need to cooperate and to see, okay, yes, it just happened here, but it will have impacts on the other ones. But that kind of cooperation is very often lacking. And that's one of the major issues that we took from the policy side to this, because a lot of people will say, okay, so what? I mean, we're connected. What does that mean? Well, it means that our governance structures are not really best suited to deal with these kinds of connected impacts. And that's what worried us, and was one of the reasons also writing this paper, to say, look, guys, we need to change the governance structure. We need to change the assessment structure. Said this before. I mean, just doing risk analysis is not enough, but we also need new governance structures, and that is something where I feel is very important, because we were very successful in kind of single risk management. Well, very successful in reducing accidents on cars and companies and whatever. We're pretty good now in dealing with single and natural hazards, but we're not very good if these kinds of combinations happen. And that's, I think, would be one of the major messages to say we need to have kind of governance bodies that go across different agencies.
Well, that's interesting take on that, where you advocate for the change of the government structures, which is perhaps may prove very difficult for many countries. That's basically they are very settled that, okay, you do this on the particular natural hazard risk and you do this in any other type of securities and all those things. Now, could that change actually be initiated by, as the UN, the United Nations, advocated from before the send their frameworks, or even the climate change, and which is they actually promote the SDGs as well to be implemented. Do this kind of change in the government structure that can manage systemic risk and polycrisis can be initiated from the UN and then advocated for the all nations in their members, or it should come from one particular country and become example for another countries?
Yeah, well, I think we can have both ways. We can do it top down and bottom up would even be on the community level. I think top down, I think it's very important that we understand that this kind of fragmentation of responsibility is a problem. And of course, on the, let's say, UN level, it's easy to say, but it's difficult to implement. And as you said before, we have frameworks. We have the Sendai framework for natural hazards. We have Codex Alimentarius for food. We have, all kinds of, codices for climate change. But we have very little ones that try to cross over. I mean, there's the International Risk Governance Council in Geneva or Lausanne, and they try to have a framework that is across different hazards so that you can make these kinds of cross-hazard analysis, but also management options. But at the same time, I think it's very important to do it, from the community level to the national level, to say, okay, well, if a community faces a specific hazard, let's say a natural hazard, it has impact on the economy, it has impact on infrastructure, it has impact on all kinds of things, even maybe schools and other things. We've seen the pandemics, people were not able to go to school and they didn't learn anything. So I think you need to make sure that people understand that these are kinds of impacts. And maybe, well, if you would like to say a little bit about Japan, because I know you're also involved in activities together also with Norio Okada, who is also, IDRiM member, to build up these kinds of colleges or whatever they're called in Japanese towns to teach people to think about the impacts of various hazards, to be better prepared also for polycrisis. Maybe you can add something to this.
Yes, I think like as already mentioned, it's not only the collaboration between the policymaker, but also the community, like the actual practitioners. So in Japan, for example, they have the education specifically for the school, the elementary school and high school level. So they have designed some games to teach and to help the community to understand the risk and aware the risk, so that they can have the better actions and response to risk. So I think the collaboration between not only the policymaker but also researchers and the communities and the practitioners, they are very important to in case of the polycrisis and the systemic risk.
Okay, I'm actually going to take this into a little controversial area for a second and think about, you talk about polycrisis and government structures. Some politicians and some governments in particular like to make risks and crisis is quite simple, and they view it as a single issue, not as a polycrisis type of issue. So one of the ways I view it is the climate crisis. So there are certain politicians, certain groups who don't believe that climate crisis is an issue. Problem is that therefore they want to go back to more traditional methods of energy. At the same time, they're also saying that the migration crisis is a problem for the country. We need to stop this. And what they're kind of doing is that by amplifying one crisis, which is then making another crisis even worse. So, do you think that this is going to become a bigger issue because we're almost like having a negative spiral of polar crisis, where governments are trying to deny one crisis and then trying to firefight another crisis, which really has its origins in the first crisis?
Yeah, I think you really have a very good point there, Mark. A very good example was the pandemics. I mean, I can get back to Germany. I mean, in 2020, from February to October, the German government felt that this was a health crisis, and they were very well equipped for health crisis. I mean, it was Germany did very well also international comparison. They reduced the number of people that were exposed to the virus, and they were very good at it. In October, it was suddenly clear that the very strong measures of having kids not going to school, of having everybody socially isolated, had a lot of negative impacts. And then the government said, okay, well, we need to make trade-offs. We have to say, maybe we get people back to school, but that means also, the virus may spread out more easily, and we have to do something. And basically, they had a very hard time to doing this. They were very well equipped to deal with one, as you said before, maybe just migration or just health issues, but were not very well equipped to think about making good trade-offs between competing goals. And that's something, and then the government, of course, which was very interesting in Germany, I mean, the trust in the government declined dramatically from September 2020 to November 2020, because probably suddenly the people felt, okay, well, this government was good in getting us protected against the virus, but they missed all the other points. and then, of course, the economic minister was fighting against the health minister, and the health minister was fighting against the minister of education, because the minister of education said, well, we need to get the kids back to school because they don't learn anything. And the health minister said, no, they're going to spread the virus. Don't do that. And then they were fighting publicly, but they couldn't get an agreement together. So the public said, okay, well, if they don't get their act together, how should we? And then, in a federal system like Germany, with different states, and different states had different rules, and everybody said, well, when I go 10 kilometers to the next state, suddenly other rules are there. I mean, people were totally confused. They felt the government was not doing a good job, and. So I think, the big lesson to learn from this is, if you optimize one risk or one crisis, you make other crises worse. And that is what makes it so difficult, because, it's not a win-win situation where you can say, oh, we have a method and that will get rid of all the crises at the time. Yeah, there are sometimes things you can do and have different crises being addressed. But most of the time, we have to make trade-offs. We have to say, okay, well, actually, we do tolerate some more health risks, but then we also have better education to our kids, and we don't have more isolation among elder people. So, and you have to justify them. I mean, it's not easy to do that, and politicians hate to do this, but there's no other way out of this, and that's exactly what we can see. And a lot of politicians or people, have two things that they do, and you mentioned that in the climate crisis: denial. Can say, oh, we just deny it, it's not there, and then we can go on. Or the other thing is to dramatize one risk and saying, oh, this is so important, we don't have to think about everything else. And in climate crisis, we have both groups, and one is saying, okay, it doesn't matter what problems we create, we have to deal with climate now, and we have to get rid of all fossil fuels at once. Of course, I mean, the economy would collapse if we do that. And I don't care, because the earth is going to explode otherwise. And the other one is saying, oh, it won't be as bad as people say, and we will find ways when we go along. And of course, both ways are not very good ways of dealing with it. But we can see it, of course, specifically among populist movements all over the world, that this kind of simplification sells very well.
That's it's very difficult now. Like if we talk about the climate crisis, and like it's like, as you mentioned, it's like the fractions between the goals we want to achieve. Whether okay, it's like one side looks at, okay, it's, oh, our future is bleak, and it's like either we fight for it or just like we let it go. It's already bleak anyway. It's just like optimize the resource that we have. Now, from the experience and the examples that you mentioned before, and then it's, I know that it's very difficult to assess the next polycrisis, and perhaps to assess the risk systematically that we have now. What are the tools that we can use now, or it's already been used to assess the polycrisis systemic risk that's already been implemented, perhaps, or there are some concept that can be, okay, we can use this concept to assess the polycrisis and systemic risk in the future?
Yeah, Huan, maybe you've had chapters there on new risk
Yes.
assessments or assessment procedures, and you might want to say a little bit more about those.
Yes, thank you. So, so actually, over the last decades, we have developed multiple tools or techniques that could, based on the principle of complexity, resilience, and network theory at outlined, we have developed, including agent-based models, system dynamic modeling, network modeling, and stress testing, and statistic and machine learning methods, and the newly developed one, the AI for modeling complex systematic impact. So those categories, those tools already developed for the system risk assessment. So, and especially for the AI for modeling, I think this is a significant and very promising one for modeling complexity system impact due to its ability to handle large data sets and uncover the patterns that traditional method may miss. So and also the AI method has the potential to enhance the predictive power by learning from the historic data, as we may collected the data set from the history cases. So the AI have the techniques and is improving the predictions as new data to make from learning from the history. So by utilize AI, the policymakers and the managers can gain deeper insights into the dynamic of complex systems and develop more robust strategies for the systemic risks. So in general, we have those agent-based models, system dynamic modeling, network modeling, and as Professor Ortwin already mentioned, the stress testing, statistic and machine learning, and AI, those methods. We already can utilize those very powerful techniques.
I think I'll hand my question over to Harris on this one, because he's our resident expert on AI.
No, yeah, it's actually mentions, but before that's actually as the tools that mentions, it's basically what I'm doing right now. That's in the Sweden's basically in Lund's well, we tackle down about the, well, instead of the looking at the crisis, perhaps it's more attributed to systemic risk, because like in here in Sweden we don't really have the natural hazards, but we're preparing for the worst, which is war. and like looking at how the systems in Sweden can actually resist if there is a war broke out. And like one of them is actually to prepare against the misinformations that can collapse the national crisis. And one of source of the misinformation right now, it's in the tools that you mentioned, which is an AI. So that's my question is there. It's basically there are many discussion of the use of AI, especially in the decision makings, and how it actually can help prepare like the systemic risk and the polycrisis, the futures, and AI also bring its own problems, and there can be a crisis in the future. So what is your take, both of you, on how the AIs can be the initiative of the polycrisis in the future? Is there any possibility on that, or it's basically it's it's likely impossible for AI because AI is just tools? What do you think about this?
Well, I think that AI, of course, has, as you all know, its good sides and its bad sides, and it depends very much on who uses it. And as you said before, you can use AI to build very good systems of disinformation, of fake news, and of manipulating people, but you can also use it to detect disinformation and manipulation effects. So it depends a little bit on who is using it and what kind of AI systems you have. And of course, if you program an AI system to be destructive, it can be very destructive. If you compose it in a way that it basically combines ethical rules with analytical thinking, then it can be very productive and also very powerful. So I think AI has its own kind of risks that is in the technology because it's still computational. But I think most of the misuse of AI is about the people who use it and who program it. And so I think it's the first thing to say. I mean, AI is not in itself bad or good. It is as good as bad as people who use it and program it and apply it. A very interesting point in terms of polycrisis is that humans are pretty limited in thinking about different dimensions at the same time. I mean, most psychologists say we can think about 7 dimensions, and that's almost the limit, and then it gets really difficult. I mean, AI can, consider, endless numbers of of dimensions, and still, have equal weight or equal attention to each of them. So that's very good for polycrisis. You can say, look, we are concerned about economy, we're concerned about environment, we're concerned about social, we're concerned about security, we're concerned. Now tell me if there are any possibility that this can impact any of these things. And AI, I think, would be very good at that and would do it, quickly, and we humans would have a hard time doing that. On the other hand, of course, what we can see is, of course, AI, specifically generative AI, is only as good as information that's out there. So we'll take, as we all know, the most probable and likely connections that they can find in the internet. And so it's very rarely producing something innovative. And very often, I mean, if there's a lot of disinformation around, they take it as serious information. So it can also be wrong. So we do need very good experts to deal with AI. But AI, if it's used as a tool, I think it can be extremely helpful for dealing with polycrisis and also for assisting cooperation between different agencies.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode on Polycrisis. This is part 1 of 2 episodes on Polycrisis with Professor Renn and Dr. Liu. We will be continuing on Polycrisis next week.